Hi guys. Oh, very loud. So I'm very excited to introduce Rob Hornstra and Arnold van Bruggen, who are the authors of the Sochi project. Rob, as you know, is a photographer. Arnold is a writer and filmmaker. And I'm not going to do any more information because they are going to give it to you themselves. So, Rob and Arnold, please.
Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming to our talk, and I hope you also had a chance to have a look at our exhibition already. Arnold and I are going to take you through our project, the Sochi project, which we've been working on since 2009 until 2014. What we're going to do during this talk, I mean, it's limited time of course, is to share with you a few chapters, a few parts of the Sochi project. We did more books and all kind of things, but we cannot share it here. If you're interested, then I would recommend you to go to the website, for example, or have a look at some of the books I have with me over here as well. And I will do the introduction, and then I will give. Then we switch the chapters. So Arnold will do a few chapters, and I will do a few chapters. What you see over here on the screen is the start of our project. It was in 2007 that the Olympic Winter Games were awarded to Sochi in Russia, and Vladimir Putin, who was very happy, mentioned in his speech, the Olympic family is going to feel at home in Sochi. And that was the moment that we started thinking about doing a project around Sochi. At that time nobody knew where Sochi was, and most of the people didn't know that the games were awarded to Russia. We were already working at that moment in the area around the Olympic Winter Games, and we thought it was a very interesting area, full of contrasts, and especially these contrasts was something we wanted to capture before the Olympic Winter Games. We had a kind of an idea that Russia and the government, of course, of Russia, and maybe even Vladimir Putin, absolutely wanted to use these games to show to the world that Russia is back on the world map, that they have power, that they can organize the most expensive winter games ever, that the stadiums will be absolutely stunning, the architecture, etc., etc. So if we look to we expected that if we look to the perspective from the Olympic Winter Games, then it would be one big show-off from the Russian side. So they used the Olympic Winter Games more or less as a kind of propaganda tool to show how powerful they are. So we thought then it's also allowed that we use the Olympic Winter Games in the same way as a propaganda tool for our, let's say, alternative stories around these Olympic Winter Games. We want to provide an atlas of words and images, that's how we called it in the beginning, about the region hosting these most expensive winter games ever. So not the Olympic bubble, not the Olympic stadiums, but the world around these Olympic stadiums, to provide at least this information for everyone who would be interested to know a little bit more about the region where these Olympic Games would be organized. And we had a plan from the beginning. We wanted to have an atlas, a big book. We wanted to have an online documentary ready before the Olympic Winter Games, and we wanted to have exhibitions, traveling exhibitions, preferably on as many places as possible in the world. To realize this, we started crowdfunding. I'm not diving very deep into crowdfunding, but it became a very important part of our way of working, because people could donate money to our project annually, and at the end of a year we gave them something back, and this something became a publication. And for that reason we also divided our project, 5-year project, into different chapters. So you have the annual publications, and the first annual publication was about Sochi, the city itself, and so we were continuing. The second one was about Abkhazia, neighboring region, and then again about Sochi, etc. The final publication, the 5th-year publication, was of course the final book, An Atlas of War and Tourism in the Caucasus. That's the book you see over here. So our ambition right from the start was to make this book, although we didn't know the content, of course, to have exhibitions everywhere. And this is the website. I hope you will look it up later at home. A short introduction to the region. What you see over here is that on the left side there is Sochi. If you go 30 kilometers to the south, then you have the Olympic stadiums. They're not built in Sochi, they're built in the middle of nowhere. There was really nothing over there. small little green fields, few farmers living over there. So it's built not in Sochi basically, but near the border with Abkhazia. And in the mountains, if you go up in the mountains over there, because you have very steep mountains, then you end up immediately in the North Caucasus. And the North Caucasus is the poorest region of Russia, a region full of human rights violations, poverty, those kind of things. And we wanted to capture all these three differences because the regions are extremely different from each other. Sochi is really tourism, Russian tourism, specific kind of tourism. Abkhazia is about isolation, a region which declared itself independence, but nobody else in the world did. So it was locked off from the world literally after a quite intense war, and it was destroyed, and it couldn't build up anything in this country. It's all about isolation. And these are the chapters we more or less did during the Sochi project. The first chapter, first year, we were just entering Russia. We decided to dive into historical Sochi, because Sochi is a very important place for Russians. It might be that the rest of the world didn't know about Sochi at that time. But for Russians, it was a very special place. It's one of the only subtropical places in Russia. And during Soviet times, if you worked, for example, in a steel factory or an iron plant or whatever, far away in Norilsk, in Siberia, in the Urals, and you worked there for 10 years, 20 years, you were sometimes awarded with the most magic thing you could ever get, and that's a trip to Sochi. And Sochi was completely filled, packed with sanatoriums. 130 kilometers of coastline only filled with sanatoriums. And these sanatoriums were specifically devoted to, let's say, the steel workers, the railway workers, those kind of things. So if you got a trip like that, that was heaven. You went with the train, you went on the train for 10 days, driving to Sochi and staying there for 3 weeks in a sanatorium, and then going back, of course. And we wanted to capture this sanatorium life because we thought it's very important to see how the sanatoriums are right now, because we heard that the sanatoriums had to transform all into 3 or 4 or 5-star hotels. Russia doesn't want to be referred to as the old Soviet country, and these sanatoriums were a kind of old Soviet places. So they wanted to transform them, close them down, transform them, renovate them into very expensive hotels. And before that would happen, we wanted to capture this old historical thing of Sochi. I will show you a short introduction video. I think then you see a little bit of Sochi, but also the reason why we wanted to capture these sanatoriums. I hope sound is on.
Где б я ни был, с дорогами споря, всегда и повсюду со мной Кавказские горы и море, и солнечный город родной, Сочи, город мой, юный город мой, город сказочной красоты, море черное, санаторий и цветы, цветы.
Удивительный цветной слайд-фильм о природе Западного Кавказа. Его не рассказывают. Приходите и увидите сами.
Очень скоро все будет здесь реконструировано, отделано современными европейскими материалами. И наши гости Олимпиады, которые в 2014 будут году наслаждаться Олимпийскими играми здесь, в Сочи, будут также наслаждаться комфортными условиями проживания в современных номерах, оборудованными по категории международной сертификации 4 звезды.
Уже, как бы это не политкорректно и некрасиво звучало, но сервис здесь тоже остался советским, по большому счету. А советский сервис, он не имеет места быть в современных реалиях. Поэтому, если человек не сможет соответствовать высоким требованиям, которые мы будем предъявлять по отношению к персоналу, мы будем вынуждены прощаться с такими людьми, потому что репутация, имидж здравницы обновленной никоим образом не может сочетаться так называемым ненавязчивым сервисом, бытовым хамством,
this is the evening disco where we also had to participate, of course. What we try to do to capture this sanatorium life is to figure out how a sanatorium is working. That's quite difficult for foreigners because everything is, of course, all Russian, and Russians know how a sanatorium works. You cannot book it on booking.com or whatever. You have to go to Sochi and try to find a place where you can buy a puchovka, and a puchovka is a special permit that you're allowed to enter a sanatorium. And then when you enter the sanatorium, you are at the reception desk, and you can probably, hopefully, registrate into the sanatorium. And if you manage to do that, then you sleep there the next night, and the next morning you hear someone banging on your door, and that's the main doctor. And the main doctor is taking you to the room where you are investigated, or where they are looking what's wrong with you. And of course, because we desperately wanted to have the treatments in the sanatorium as well, we already made up some kind of things which were wrong with us. So I had, for example, problems with my knees and with my back, and elbow problems and those kind of things. Arnoold also had those kind of... I'm not sure if they totally believed us, but that doesn't matter. We got a full program with treatments, beautiful treatments, like you see over here. This is an electrically loaded clay treatment for my back. Although I didn't mention that I had problems with my back, but that's also the problem. If you don't speak the language, then they start mixing us up and we get different treatments. However, these plaques of clay, they are, so they charge up the volume of electricity, and at the moment that you feel that it starts burning on your back, then you have to say stop. That's the moment you have to say stop. The problem is I don't speak Russian, so I didn't know anything about when I had to say stop. But however, we survived the treatments, which are always in the morning, and then in the afternoon you can go to the beach to rest, which literally means drink something on the beach. At least that was what most of the people do. And then in the evening hours, there is always a celebration of, as you could see, there was a celebration of chai, or there's a disco event or whatever. And this is what let's say, older Russians really love. They love these sanatoriums. They're fully booked all summer at least, but also mainly in winter they are also booked. So we really wanted to capture this culture, but also truly understand why it is so extremely interesting for Russians to go to sanatoriums. So we booked a sanatorium for 2 weeks to stay there and to see if we could understand what's so interesting about staying in a sanatorium. And we made a small little publication out of it. And this publication became the start of the Sochi project. I have to be honest with you that when we entered the sanatorium, I didn't completely believe the treatments which we were doing over there with this kind of equipment. And this is a bathtub which will be filled with a kind of, you notice, this egg-smelling water which seems to be healthy for you, although I never know if it's true. The strange thing is that after 2 weeks we really felt worse instead of better. So that was something which probably didn't work for us. However, we made a story out of it. Arnoold wrote the story as if he was, let's say, a civilian going to a sanatorium. And the reason why I also show this to you, this is really the way we prefer to work. Of course, we could have gone to a sanatorium for our project and have a guided tour by the director and let us explain what a sanatorium is. But the beauty of slow journalism, and we call it slow journalism because it's a fashionable term nowadays, but you can call it whatever you like, that doesn't matter. But it's so beautiful about our profession that we really take the time and get the time to investigate, to research things, to be there on the spot and to see what will happen. And I really prefer this compared to, let's say, the fast journalism side. The next chapter within our project is about Abkhazia. I will skip this chapter. There are stacks with newspapers, which was actually our way to attract you to our talk. We try to... Yeah. So we have a free newspaper for everyone who's really quick, because apparently there are 60, 70 newspapers, so not sure if anyway, this is a different project which we did in between projects, and unfortunately due to time I cannot really explain what it was. What you see over here, we created a multifunctional newspaper exhibition. You can use it as a newspaper, but you can also make your own exhibition at home, and you see it over here, or in a museum. However, now I switch to the second chapter, and the second chapter is about this isolated, small little breakaway republic, Abkhazia, really bordering the Olympic stadiums. And Arnoold will do this chapter.
It's actually that close that when you will climb on top of one of these stadiums, you will actually see Abkhazia lying in the distance in the other bay, so to say. So Abkhazia, we knew, was going to become a hot topic in Russia or over the world because it was that close to Sochi and Russia, and it's a conflict zone, you know. Abkhazia used to be a part of Georgia. In the beginning of the 1990s, through a very bloody civil war, it broke away from Georgia, and they sent like 200,000 plus people, Georgians, back to Georgia and the country became empty, desolate place. It used to be really a very beautiful place, like the place where the elite would go. Brezhnev had a dacha there, Stalin had a dacha there, like holiday home. So it's a very beautiful, pristine area, but completely empty, of course. Of the 500,000 people who lived there in 1990, so to say, only 200,000 people lived there. But it's unrecognized. Nobody in 2007-8 recognized Abkhazia as an independent country. And how can you organize winter games really at the border of a conflict zone? What would Georgia do with this border when the Olympic Games would be there? So Russia had a big problem, and in the run-up to the Olympic Games, and actually during our project, they decided to recognize Abkhazia. So in the end, they sent Russian military troops to the border, the further border with Georgia. They recognized Abkhazia, and they managed to get some 4 or 5 allies all around the world to recognize Abkhazia as well. Really obscure countries like Vanuatu, Nauru, Tuvalu, they all recognized Abkhazia. So like 5 countries now recognize Abkhazia, and it's an independent state. And Russia all of a sudden lost one problem, you know? The Olympic Games were no longer bordering a conflict zone, officially, according to them. But Abkhazians, they're a very nationalistic, proud kind of people, of course. They managed to kick out the Georgians, now they're independent. They don't see all this rubbish. It was very funny always when we went to a house or to a store and we sat there, drank tea or coffee or something stronger. And then we said, wow, how can you live here? Look at all these ruins everywhere. You can see them up in the hills. You can see them on the other side of the street. And they said, well, these ruins, why don't you see this beautiful tree? And somehow they only saw the beautiful side of their country. And that is also very funny, actually, to see for us. We also a little bit, despite all the political situations and discussions around this country, fall in love with this country. And you can see that Angela, she was many times when we went through Abkhazia, she was a student English and international relations, and she was our tour guide, or our translator, more, that's a better way to say it. She explains Abkhazia for you. This is the book. Actually, a short story before I'll show up Angela. We start the book almost like a fairy tale book, because Abkhazia is this beautiful and people are so proud and nationalistic that it's all in such a small, desolate country that you almost start considering it as a fairy tale country. Of course, the country is full of social problems, political problems, so in the end you should be realistic as well. But we decided to start the book with their completely poetic point of view. So you can see it here. This is the creation story of Abkhazia. They said that God convened all the people all around the world to his place, and there he would divide the world among all the nations. But the Abkhazians, they were much too late, because they kept on receiving guests and people were passing by and they fed them food and drinks and everything. So they were much too late when God divided all the land. But when the Abkhazians finally arrived with God, he said, oh, you're too late. But I know why you're too late. You're such a hospitable, nice people. You know what? I give you the best piece of land I have. Actually, I reserved this piece of land for myself. But know what? When I give you the best piece of land, everyone will fight for you, like for a young woman. So that's how they say why they have all these wars and these refugee problems and all this horror. But they know they live on the best place of earth. Funnily enough, all the peoples in the Caucasus have the same story. So the Georgians have the same story, the Chechens have the same story. So they all believe they were too late for the party and were given the best piece of land. This is Angela.
Hi, my name is Angela Pataraya. I'm Abkhazian. I'm 22. I study international relations at Abkhaz State University. It's my 4th year. My country is a country of soul. It's really beautiful, and it has a long history, which have seen different invaders like Arabs, Persians, Greeks, Byzantine, Russians, Turks, Georgians, but hopefully we freed ourselves from Georgian annexation in the war of 92-93, and we're very thankful for that to people, to our people, and to all those who supported us during the war. And now we enjoy our independence and our statehood and stability that we have. So despite that we're recognized only by 4 countries, we still enjoy it, and we're looking with hope for the better. Unfortunately, I must say that the outcomes of the war are still visible, and that's why our beautiful cities are ruined, and our living standards are still low, and our economy is only developing. But still, I and my family, as many families in Abkhazia, have suffered the war, but we're still surviving. We're still looking for future with hope. And I would say that living in such a great country, such a beautiful country, is very good. It's very nice. We've very, very nice mountains covered with snow even in the summer. We have very warm Black Sea. We have nicest resorts, and we have the most hospitable people here. And we have very good food, spicy bit, but very good. So I would like to invite all the foreigners, all from European, from the West, from all over the world, to come and visit Abkhazia, because you won't feel sorry about that. You'll be happy about it. Believe me, I know. I traveled to some countries and I haven't seen a country that is better than mine. Look at it. It's awesome. It's amazing. So I encourage the world society to open their hearts to Abkhazians, and Abkhazians will pay you back with what we can do best, accept a guest, because guest is ambassador of God. So I welcome everybody to Abkhazia. Enjoy your time.
So feel invited. It's really a beautiful country. So from this sort of fairy tale-like country, and the country where these people are so proud of, we started to think, okay, but you're a country of 200,000 people, so small, so isolated. All the borders are officially closed. They can't have airplanes going out. They can't have boats going out. How do you survive? And of course, we knew that the whole structure of the state was a sort of Russian security services infused, mafia infused, Chechen mafia infused sort of structure. We didn't want to dive too deep into that. We wanted more to show the human dilemmas and the human ways of going through such a situation. How can you live in a country that is so isolated? And how does a country actually function? So we did 2 things. We tried to get the human story. How do you survive such a situation? And how do you manage a country which is so small that you actually know everyone in this country? That's what we did in the book. So we visited the prisons, we visited all the ministries. Actually, when you go to the capital, Sukhumi, or Sukhum as they call it, you have all the ministries of Abkhazia in one very small building. I think they would fit in this building. So you have a hallway, that's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, then another hallway, that's the Ministry of Economic Affairs, a very small room, that's the Ministry of Tourism, and so on and so on. A bigger building is the Embassy of Russia, because they're actually ruling the country somehow. Here you can see the way we did the book. We were very much looking for a way how to tell the story as a real non-fiction novel, so to say. So it should be a book which you could read through, like when you were lying in bed or in a chair or in the train, maybe wherever. At the same time, when you would flip the book, you would have a photo book. So we tried to somehow combine this as perfect as possible to have both kinds, as you can see. 2 boys up in the mountains protecting the border. An old man we kept visiting. I think we spent 5 times in Abkhazia and kept coming back to him. And in the end, of course, because he was that old, he fought in the Second World War, was very weak. In the end, we could only visit his grave. And so we tried to go to every town, every village, every place in Abkhazia and tried really to map it as a small independent country, how can it function? When we published the book in 2009, we thought, okay, the Olympic Games will be coming, so in the next 5 years during our project, we will see huge change in Abkhazia. This country will profit so much from these Olympic Games really next door. They will send labor to Sochi, they will get investments from Russia, so maybe we'll see a completely different country when we come back in 2014 or 13. But as you can see, when we came back in 2013, we already sold the first edition of our book, our 2009 copy of Empty Land, Promised Land, Forbidden Land, that's the title. And we saw no single change. Everything was kept completely the same. The border with Russia was quite closed. The border with Georgia has always been more or less closed. And, well, nothing was going on. People were living their sort of lives, almost gotten used to these 20 years of isolation. A little bit frustrated by the lack of investment and the lack of change. But hey, they just lived on in their very small society. So here we made the cover of our new book. So we were here with the first edition of the book at the river, which was the cover. And here Rob photographed the cover of the second edition, which was exactly the same, despite of the change in season a little bit. So that's it about Abkhazia. Now Rob will tell more about Sochi and modern tourism.
I will keep this chapter very short because the last chapter is actually what we consider to be the most important chapter, and that's about the North Caucasus. What we did was going back to Sochi in our stories. First we did historical Sochi, and then we went to Abkhazia. I have to explain to you that we were traveling in all these regions all the time, but we made the publications about the different chapters. And we also wanted to capture modern life tourism in Sochi. And Sochi is a sleeping city in winter, and in summer it comes to life and everybody starts working there because they want to earn as much money as possible in tourism. And Russian tourism is in a way very simple. You have a beach and you need restaurants and you need singers in the restaurants. So you can try to make a very multi-layered story about Sochi, but we thought that doesn't really fit or doesn't really match our expectations of Sochi. So we wanted to keep it in a way simple, and we wanted to show the bling bling or the gloss or the loudness or the noisiness in Sochi through a metaphor. And while we were sitting in a restaurant in 2011, so we were traveling there already for a while, we wanted to, that's what you always do as journalists, of course. In the evening hours, you need to have some food, so you need to go to a restaurant. And we were discussing a little bit about what to do the next morning, make some phone calls, what we did during the past days, etc., etc. So you need to conversate a little bit with each other, to speak a little bit with each other. But that became impossible once again, because at 8 o'clock the singer comes in with a laptop under the arm, plugs in the laptop and starts singing. And if you think singing is the kind of background music in Sochi, then you are totally wrong. Singing in Sochi for a karaoke singer is as loud as possible, which means literally that if I start shouting in the ear of Arnoold, it's questionable if he understands what what I will say to him. So, and I don't know if you know Russian chanson and pop, so usually we use our own device, our own computer, but maybe you can hear it. So of course, you need to hear the bass as well, but that's excluded if you do it like this. So I will leave it on in the background. We decided that this frustration of sitting there and not be able to communicate with each other anymore could be a nice moment to start investigating these singers. So we made our first photos. This was one of the first photos as well. And I came back home and thought, like, it's not only interesting because of the phenomenon, but especially for me because of the surrounding, the place where these singers are singing. I like all these interiors in these restaurants. What I told you in the beginning, Russians don't like to be referred to as a Soviet country. Soviet style is a very specific style. I think everybody knows more or less how it looks. But that you have to replace it with something. And the question is, of course, with what you can replace this style. You have a kind of cultural background. it's taken away because you don't want to have a Soviet cultural background. And how do you replace it? You cannot just say like, I choose a new culture. It's not for sale somewhere in the world. So you see all kind of different styles, usually handmade, customized by the owner of the restaurant. Very nice, for example, here, that the pants of the, well, whatever. Here you see, and you saw many international influence also in these pictures. Here you see, for example, a castle in Switzerland. This is, I don't know what style it is. Seems to me kind of Roman Greek. This is Persian. So they choose all of these kind of different styles to cover up the old Soviet style. And what I particularly like as well about these things is that they're always, you have so many toilet signs in the, that's what I mean. And also you have many refrigerators here on the left side, which also always neighboring the States. And here if you look good, and I shot it on a medium format with a big flash, so the larger pictures are quite bright. But also in the book you can see it well. Then you see all those small little beautiful details which you don't see at night, for example, that they put away all the broken glass behind the table of the singer over here. That became a series. Surprisingly won this series World Press Photo, which gave us a lot of attention for the project, so we are very grateful, of course, to World Press Photo. And we also wanted to exhibit it, and that's what you see over here. We've been working on the exhibition, or on the concept for the exhibition, for 1.5 years, because we really didn't know how to exhibit it. And finally we invented the 42-piece billboards. So you get it in a box like this, and then you can open it, and you have to hang it yourself, so it becomes one large poster, which looks like a real image if you have some distance, but if you get closer, the closer you get, the more artificial it becomes. And that's basically also how we saw Sochi, so it matches more or less the concept of the project. You see that it becomes tiles, but if you get even more closer, then you see that we made it on purpose very pixelated, and so it's very artificially. Okay, I'll leave the stage to, here you see some more examples. This is a very nice example of a bookstore in Brussels. Because also with this newspaper, which we're going to spread out, I see the stack arrived, so that's very good. We try to make things often multifunctional, so we don't want to be those artists who only show their work inside museums. Then you reach a very, very limited audience. So we try to make things either multifunctional or specially adapted to a public space, or those kind of things. We also try to give away as much as possible. And in this case, with the Sochi singers, that's very suitable to do it indeed in a museum, but you can also do it on the streets. And this bookstore owner in Brussels called me and said, I have a very good idea. I place it on the shutter door because the shutter door is closing at 8 o'clock at night. So she comes on stage exactly at the moment that she also in Sochi comes on stage. And the next morning she's leaving again, so she's only there at night. So I thought that's a perfect metaphor, perfect way to use these kind of materials as well. And now, until now, it might be a little bit funny, or isolation is of course not funny about Abkhazia. Now we're diving into the really problematic area.
So welcome to the North Caucasus. So this is the area you saw in the beginning at the north part of the mountain range. These are all these difficult republics. Maybe you know them, maybe you don't. Chechnya is one of the most famous, Dagestan, but Kabardino-Balkaria or Karachay-Cherkessia are lesser known. North Ossetia. All these very small republics in the north of the Caucasus where the Russians, they're actually part of the Russian Federation, used to be part of the Russian Empire, but all in these republics there live very much independent nations, around 50 to 60 different nations. They were conquered by the Russians in the 19th century. They were colonized by the Russians, and they are still colonized by the Russians, and many of those inhabitants still feel it like that. So there's a lot of revolt in these countries. There are separatist groups, there are political Islamist groups who try to fight against the Russian and local government. So there's a huge stack of unrest. We knew, that's why you see this picture, that this chapter would become the most difficult of all these things. I mean, it's of course very innocent to go around in restaurants in Sochi, or also in Abkhazia, where we visit the president a few times because it's so small, so you can just ask for the president, and 15 minutes later you're sitting drinking coffee with the president. You know, these are, for us, it was almost piece of cake to make this kind of stories. But in the North Caucasus, we knew it was getting a little bit more difficult. You have like in all these republics, every republic has its own security services. Then you had the federal security services from Moscow. And then there was local police and the separatist groups. So we knew we had to take care. But of course, it's quite difficult. We started with very small, innocent subjects as well in the North Caucasus, just to get a feel of it. So we did wrestling. Wrestling is very popular there. We did this newspaper, which is about a very small village. In the end, it got quite political, but at the beginning, it was just a description of a very small village on the other side of the mountains of Sochi. But in the end, of course, we had to tackle the big themes, and these are human rights violations, these are separatism, these are kidnaps by local police who kidnap people they think are suspicious. And that brought us in a lot of trouble. As you can see here, this was actually when we wanted to visit the hotbed of separatism in the North Caucasus. So like the place where it all began in the 19th century, where the political Islam was invented actually in this region, and where it's still very unresty. Rob took one picture of this village from the other side of the canyon, and we were immediately arrested. A car drove by, and 4 guys in leather jackets, you know, these civil clothes, plainclothes policemen, jumped out and immediately took us to the next small city and took us hostage for a small day. And afterwards, they took our passports, and we had to go back to the capital to be interrogated. Of course, such long days, the policemen in the end, they are friendly with you sometimes, and they bring you tea, and sometimes they even leave, so that gave us a little time to play with their heads and make a little bit fun in these stupid long days of waiting and being interrogated. Very stupid interrogation, of course, because they knew why we were there and we knew why we were there. So they kept asking stupid questions about who is Tolstoy? Why do you know about Tolstoy, this famous writer? Well, you know, very stupid discussions. In the end, we knew that to make the biggest contrast with Sochi, which was the capital of pleasure, of Olympic Games, of glamour and glitter, and this $50 billion pumped into a very small spot, we knew we had to look for the contrast. And the contrast with North Caucasus, of course, is very easy. It's the history of violence and conflict, of human rights violations. And it's a very complex history, of course. I mean, 50 different peoples, so many different republics, a complex history. So we knew we had to bring all these stories back to a very simple narrative. And it took us a long while, actually. But in the end, we found this woman, Gava Gaisanova, and she became, we thought, actually we only found it out when we were back in the Netherlands, and I kept going through all my notes in the notebooks. In the end, I thought, hey, in her personal history is all the history of this North Caucasus encapsulated. Like her family was originally from the mountains, but in the 19th century, the Russians drove them away from the mountains to the flatlands, so to say, because there they posed little or less danger. Then in the Second World War, Stalin started having suspicion about all these different peoples, and he said, okay, we have to get rid of these peoples. We sent them away to Siberia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. So all of a sudden, Gava herself was born in Kazakhstan instead of in Ingushetia, where she came from originally. So the 5 peoples, with the Chechens, Ingush, and some others, were forcibly removed to Central Asia. Then she got embroiled in this civil war going on around 1990, which also struck the North Caucasus. And a few years ago, her husband got kidnapped. Her husband was a Muslim guy, a technician, and he drove in his car through the nearest city and was stopped by the police and security forces. And somehow they had some suspicion that he may be part of some separatist movement, which wasn't true. So they found the car later with his driving license inside and his passport and everything inside except her husband. And he has never been found again. He's completely disappeared. And it happened to so many thousands of people. So she became the main character of our story in her life, and we also fell in love with her very strong eyes and dramatic picture we found of her. This is an old picture we found in her collection. She became the main figure of the North Caucasus. In the book, we actually did it like this. Let's see. We made one chapter about Gava, so all the even chapters you can see, 2, 4, 6, 8, etc. They are about Gava. They are her personal life history, and it goes like this through the book. And then all the uneven chapters, the introduction 1, 3, 5, etc. They are the bigger stories. So continuously from the very small personal story of Gava Gaisanova, we come back to the bigger history and show, put it in perspective, so to say, her very small personal history. So we use archival images. This is actually the photo where we immediately got arrested. On the other side of the mountain or the canyon, you see Gyumri, the hotbed of terrorism and separatism in the North Caucasus. A bomb explosion. In our exhibition, you can see the video actually of this explosion, the CCTV footage of it, right in the beginning of the exhibition. And we spoke to so many people in the North Caucasus. We went from, it's almost like an anthropological approach. We went from town to town, from village to village, knocked doors, saw people. This was one of the doctors in the hospitals, and we asked him about what happens, you know, when such a terror attack happens, or when the Russians invade some village. What happens afterwards? What do you experience? How do you go through all these decades of violence in this region? And he told us all these bloody stories and showed us the fragments of all the killings and bombs he found in bodies, as you see here. This is the husband of Gava, who disappeared. Actually, during the writing of our book, we got news that he was officially proclaimed dead by the court. After 5 years missing, you're proclaimed dead. And during our writing and during our making of this book, we more or less personally experienced this violence, because many people we met actually died during the making of our work. This is a policeman who was hit by a grenade from separatist groups. Another one, a girl was hit by during a terror attack in Beslan, a very well-known terror attack in the school in Beslan. And this guy, he was a very prominent Muslim politician in Dagestan. And he was very fierce and said, I will not use violence myself, but I'm really proud of my heritage, of my culture, of my religion, and I want to be free in acting upon that. And of course, he always predicted it in his interview with us. A few months later, he was pulled out of his car, where he drove with his wife and daughter, and shot dead by masked men. And it happened so much. Another guy, an imam in North Ossetia, one of the Christian republics in the North Caucasus, an imam who gave us this prophetic quote. Look at these imams. He showed a picture of a conference with some imams he attended, and he pointed out all these different imams, and he said they're all dead. Every one of them was shot or blown up by extremists. And a few months later, during the writing of a book, he was killed as well, blown up in his car. For us, this was very important, you know. Russia was the glittery country where Putin had this big show in 2014, the Olympic Games, but so close by. Of course, in the whole Russia, there are many human rights violations, many problems with the democracy and everything, but so close by happened all these different things. And this quote of a human rights activist in the North Caucasus is a quote I like a lot. You know, on paper, Russia is a well-functioning democracy where everything is quite well organized, but in practice it's a completely different country. And especially this, what they would also show during the games, you know, it looks so well, so glittery, so glossy, but when you look a little bit behind it, when you scratch the glitter and glamour off, you have a completely different face of it all. And that's how we, in the end, we published our book about Gava Gaisanova in 2013, and immediately afterwards had to rush towards the final chapters. So all these different books we explained were actually chapters of our project we sent to our donators and sold. But then we had to work together to the end of the project, the atlas and the exhibition and the website.
Yeah, I think one last thing I have to add about the project is, and probably many of you know it as well, we were arrested multiple times and also interrogated, and it always costs you a couple of days in Russia, which is not always nice, and also there it was not only interrogating, it was also intimidating, and etc., etc. And of course all of this, and that's a kind of predictable result, is that we were kicked out of the country at a certain point, or our visa are not prolonged. So we couldn't enter the country anymore after July 2013, which led to a kind of perfect scenario Because of this, that our visa was rejected, we got a lot of press attention at the moment that we announced it in the press. Not only in Dutch media, but also international media, and even more important for us, especially in the Russian media as well. So we got, thanks to the fact that we were refused, although I absolutely don't like it because I would like to go back to Russia, we got a lot of extra attention for our project. Here you see the final book very shortly. We have the book over here. Now it's in a second edition. This one sold out around the Olympic Games, also due to the fact that there was so much media attention. On the second edition, that you see that we used a different quote on the cover of the book. It was the quote done by the CEO of Sochi 2014 during his end speech for millions of people watching his end speech of the Olympic Winter Games. And he said, "This is the new face of Russia, our Russia." So we use this beautiful quote also, once again, on our project. So every time we adopt their advertising quotes for Russia to promote our project as well. Hope you will visit the website as well. We translated it into English and Russian, in case there are Russians in the audience. And I want to finish actually with the film, which also introduces the project, and it's you can see it on the website as well, but it gives you a kind of short and good introduction of the reasons why we have been working in this region for 5 years.
Ladies and gentlemen, Sochi 2014 could not be where it is today without support, vision and passion of one man, President Vladimir Putin.
Mr. President, members of the International Olympic Committee, Sochi is a unique place. On the seashore, you can enjoy a fine spring day, but up in the mountains, it's winter. We are allocating around sum of $12 billion for this. Mesdames et messieurs, soutenez s'il vous plaît le rêve olympique de millions de Russes. The Olympic family is going to feel at home in Sochi. Thank you.
So now there's room for questions, I guess.
You worked for a long time in a foreign land where you don't speak the language, where you kind of trying to say a story which is very critical of that land and their policies, and you've been arrested many times and sort of picked up on that. There must have been a lot of fear or wariness about how you were operating, and were there strategies that you evolved to stay under the radar, and how did you navigate kind of being able to do your work and not getting into trouble?
Well, first we tried very hard to speak the language so we could somehow get our way around, you know, on the streets and everything. And our first strategy was openness. So never lie about anything. Don't move your way around things, but go straight towards it. We always worked with very good translators, people who helped us get appointments and were going with us to these appointments. But all the time, also during the arrest and during the work in difficult regions, we tried to work in a smart way, so to say, so to build up to more dangerous or more tricky situations. So leave them to the end of the project. But always when we were arrested or when we spoke to people, we were very open about what we were doing and what's our plan. which is actually making an atlas of the region in the run-up to the Olympic Games. And we always said that, and that was never the problem. Of course, Russia has, as the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, a huge tradition in calling foreigners spies. So we were being called spies a lot of times, not only by policemen or officers, but also by local people who thought, what the hell are these two guys doing in our village? We never see any foreigners, and all of a sudden they're here with the cameras walking around endlessly. So we had some problems in that, but openness is really very smart strategy.
Yeah, when you went up north and the amount of fear and the terror that you've described in that area, do the younger generations now, are they all trying to move out of that area and settle down somewhere else? Or do they still feel like they belong to it because it is their hometown despite of the terror there? Are they all trying to move out? Are they making an effort to move out, knowing the history or knowing
Yeah, it's a problem for whole Russia that young people are trying to move out. So there's a huge number of people leaving the country. And also, as you can see in our red newspaper, on the other side of the mountains, this is a village where there used to be 2 factories and a lot of people working also in the farms surrounding the village. And now everybody has left for the big cities or even gone abroad.
It's easy for them to move out?
No, it's never easy to move out, of course. No, you have to apply visa or go someplace. But from this village, people even go to Abkhazia to move out. So that says something about the sort of hopelessness of this region.
Okay.
It's also important to realize about North Caucasus, for example, that people from the North Caucasus are extremely discriminated in the rest of Russia. So they can either choose to go to Moscow, where life is probably a bit better, but they are discriminated and they have a slightly different skin and slightly different darker hair, and so people recognize them. And then going outside Russia, Russia is not considered to be a war zone, although we consider this whole North Caucasus almost as a civil war zone. But nobody knows about it, but because nobody can write about it, because journalists are immediately kicked out of the country. And correspondents are not working there because they are afraid of losing their job. So there's very few known about the North Caucasus in general. So there are not many opportunities for young people to move away from the area. They can move in the country, but then they're discriminated. What makes it for sense? So they can move outside, and they cannot move outside the country because they get a tourist visa or whatever maybe. So it's very difficult for them to move away.
I had a question about the working of the both of you together. Like, is there a conflict of in how you want to portray things, or like I've really seen a lot of solo projects and how vision has gone out. Maybe the editor helped out and all that. But how did you guys, like, how did it come up? How do you go through it? Or maybe somewhere you had a conflict between your expression or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Constant fighting, that's the answer.
Well, it's not only the two of us, but it's also the design team, Kummer and Herman in the Netherlands, who were involved in every presentation of the work, so the books, the exhibitions, etc., etc., etc. And all of us have strong opinions about everything. So that makes it indeed very interesting to work with each other because, it's a lot of discussion, a lot of fighting with each other. That's also what we're looking for in work. I mean, we want to be challenged by the other. Otherwise, if you only say like, oh, I like you so much and your work is so good and fantastic, then the work doesn't become sharper or better. So, was it always fun? No, it wasn't always fun, but most of the time it was. And during traveling, we decided always to do everything together. For whatever reason, we decided this, but we wanted to go with each other. I wanted to understand what Arnoold was writing about. Arnoold wanted to understand what I was photographing. So that's the reason why we always went together. And it has a lot to do with the fact that we strongly believe in coincidence in this work which we do. So if you go somewhere, and I don't want to go, for example, to a 4-hour interview with a scientist in a kind of boring university, then suddenly in this university someone pops up who is very interesting to make a photo of. And that's the kind of coincidence we are both always looking for. That's also why we like to, because Arnoold mentioned we had very good fixers. In a way that's true, but we are not looking for professional fixers. So let's say the journalist fixers, because they fix always the same for all the journalists. So we try to find either local people, most of them students like Angela, or in the North Caucasus we used a professional from Moscow because we didn't want to bring locals into danger. But the thing is that we always try to be avoid that they organize everything. So they say like, in the morning you go there, in the afternoon you go there, etc., etc. We want to be dropped off in a village and just knock on doors or start speaking to people, and then you get these coincidental stories. And that made it very intense in the North Caucasus, because we started discovering that although we try to work with coincidence, still every second door you had such a terrible story. And that made the North Caucasus so intense and important for us.
Could you speak a bit more about the role of design in the way you present your work? Because it seems to be very systematic in terms of exposing propaganda and, debunking a lot of myths and things like that. But design seems to be a really important aspect in terms of how you exhibit your work.
I think one of the biggest mistakes for photographers is that they believe they're also designers. So I absolutely don't believe. Design is a very complicated profession for which you have to study many, many years. And of course, most of the photographers have a feeling for design, but the subtle details, that's really something for designers. We prefer to work with designers who are conceptual designers. So they're not simply designing typography or those kind of things, but they have a concept behind their design. And that makes it very interesting for us to work with Kummer and Herman. The start of our project, we understood we needed to have designers because we needed to have a really good presentation in the world, because we were doing crowdfunding. So we needed to present ourselves, we needed to be active in presenting ourselves, but we needed help from external people, designers, conceptual designers, to do it in a decent way, to do it in a good way. So they also came up with, for example, the slogan "Safe Slow Journalism," or with the introduction newspaper, which I very shortly showed you completely in the beginning of the slideshow, which was a newspaper which you could immediately fold out to a very big, large photo. So those kinds of concepts from designers are very important to us. That's basically our collaboration with designers.
I'm curious, you ended your project in 2014. Was that because you could not go back? And if you could go back, what would you do next?
I think there were a few plans. First of all, we had an exhibition opening on 12 October 2013 on a very big art gallery. It would have been the biggest exhibition. So we wanted to go there. That's the first thing, in Moscow. The thing is, we couldn't go there, so everything collapsed afterwards. That was also the moment that we announced the fact that we were rejected in Russia. Within 5 days after we were rejected, the exhibition in Moscow was also cancelled, because they didn't dare to organize this exhibition anymore, which, by the way, generated even more media attention, so that was the good part. There was also a plan that we probably would go to the Olympic Winter Games, not to visit the competitions, but to go back to all these people in our stories and to see what they were doing literally on the moment that the whole world was looking to these competitions. We didn't manage to do that. And it's not a problem, because let's say it's now not a problem not to go to Russia. I can wait for a couple of years not to go to Russia, because the project is finished. So therefore it doesn't matter anymore. But both of us really, really, really love Russia. We don't like the government. We don't like the regime over there, but all the rest, we really love it over there. And there are so many interesting stories to tell. Yesterday I mentioned, by the way, and I think that's very good news, that there is a very interesting young generation of photographers coming up in Russia. So it's not that we need to do those kind of jobs, because they are taking this over as well.
What is your next project? Are you interested in doing project in India?
Sorry, one more time?
What is your next project? And are you interested in doing next project in India?
Oh yeah, I would love to do that.
And what will be that project? Like
Well, first about my next project, I decided to do the opposite, more or less, of the Sochi project, which is focusing on a very large global event known by everybody in a very big, important country in the world. So now I decided to focus on my neighbor in a totally insignificant city in the world, Utrecht, and a lower class neighborhood where he and I were living. He died 2 years ago. He was found drowned in the canal, and I followed him already for 5 to 6 years. And I'm working on this project. It's getting bigger and bigger, but it's a very personal project. Also because people consider me, as I mentioned it yesterday, as a Russia photographer, which I'm totally not. But coincidentally, I've been working in Russia for 10 years. Can happen in your life. It might be India, maybe in the future also for 10 years. Who knows?
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Arnold. Thank you very much.